Hi everyone, today we're going to be looking at Sheila Birling's character in An Inspector Calls. We'll be going through key quotes, how she links to major themes like social responsibility, gender, and class, and we'll also discuss her character development throughout the play. If you'd like a quick overview of key quotes and themes for the entire play, make sure to check out my video which I'll link below. Okay, so let's jump straight into Sheila's character. So to start off, who is Sheila Birling? We know she's the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Birling, and therefore she's of the upper class. She's also considered the younger generation in the play. Sheila also initially acts as a capitalist, but by the end of the play presents the major elements of having a socialist attitude. And because of this transformation, she exemplifies social awareness and responsibility by the end of the play. Let's look at a couple of quotes to get a sense of her character and how she develops before jumping into themes. The first quote shows Sheila to be talking about her engagement ring given to her by Gerald Croft. This quote shows how initially Sheila was very motivated by materialism and wealth. Sheila prioritizing the diamond ring, in contrast to the priorities of Eva Smith, emphasized to the audience the concerns of the upper class versus the lower class. In contrast to this, the second quote from later in the play, where Sheila says, "But these girls aren't cheap labor, they're people," challenges Mr. Birling's capitalist views and shows how the upper class exploit the lower class. As a close analysis point here, you can say the dash is how Sheila's feelings of being overwhelmed with awareness and social responsibility is highlighted through her dialogue. This quote is also really important because it marks one of the first moments when she begins to question her class-based exploitation. The blunt phrase cheap labour shows how workers like Eva are dehumanized, but Sheila pushes back with the phrase they're people, using emotive language to restore Eva's humanity. It's also a powerful line because it shows us Sheila is capable of empathy and moral growth very early on in the play. Now let's look at how Sheila links to some of the play's key themes, starting with social responsibility. Firstly, she tells her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Birling, "It's you two who are being childish, trying not to face the facts." This quote allows the audience to contrast the difference in attitudes between her and her parents at this point in the play. It also echoes Sheila's personal growth as a character. In other words, it's highlighting her emotional intelligence and maturity in comparison to Mr. and Mrs. Birling's selfishness and their lack of social responsibility. Now this contrasts the next quote, which is not said by Sheila but instead by Gerald. After finding out that Inspector Gall is not a real inspector, Gerald tells Sheila everything's alright now, highlighting that he has clearly not understood the idea of social responsibility. Whereas Sheila is deeply impacted by Inspector Gall's visit, and this reshapes her perspective on prejudice and the lower class completely. Another quote for Sheila and her connection to social responsibility is her apologising and taking accountability for her actions towards Eva Smith. You can argue that here again, the dash in her dialogue is used to show she's genuinely overwhelmed with remorse, unlike Mr. and Mrs. Birling. This brings us on quite nicely to a Mrs. Birling quote, which contrasts Sheila's quote. Mrs. Birling says she accepts no blame for it at all. Unlike Sheila, the dash in Mrs. Birling's quote can be said to highlight how offended she is that she should even have the burden of social responsibility. This is a great quote to compare here because the parallels in their language, but also the intention of them being polar opposite, is how Priestley emphasizes the difference in capitalist attitudes versus socialist attitudes. Okay, so now let's move on to look at Sheila and social class. As Sheila slowly transitions to think more like Inspector Gall, she tells the rest that they must not try to put a wall between themselves and Eva Smith. This has a greater message where Sheila's now saying that there should be no segregation in terms of treatment between the upper and lower class. Sheila breaking these boundaries, which her character was initially so entrenched in, and becoming more assertive in her dialogue, conveys the idea that she's becoming a socialist and realising the faults of being a selfish upper-class member of society. Now, we've already talked about this second quote, but if you are ever asked about Sheila and social responsibility, it's also great to use. That being said, notice that many of these quotes are versatile. For example, we could also use this if we were making a point about Sheila and gender and her defending other women. Try to do this with other character quotes too. Practicing pulling quotes and connecting them to different themes will advance your skill of manipulating quotes in your favour for any exam question. So it's definitely worth taking the time to do this. Okay, great, so now let's move on to Sheila and her links to gender. So at the beginning of the play, Sheila is shown to conform to her traditional gender roles. She's excited about her engagement and she lets the men do the talking. However, over time, she begins to find her voice. This first quote is her angry reaction to finding out that Gerald has been disloyal when his relationship with Daisy Renton comes to light. Now, this is very empowering for a woman like Sheila because she doesn't settle for Gerald because he's a man with more money and of a higher class. Instead, she stands up for herself despite the odds, which liberates the socialist mindset and attitude. Make a note that you can also draw parallels between Sheila and Eva. Eva tries to stand up to Mr. Birling when she demands a raise. Now, this would have taken a lot of courage for her to point out that the upper class can be doing more. Now, in a similar way, we see Sheila standing up for herself, and although the circumstances are different, Priestley is trying to push this idea that as socialists, misogyny and class is not something to be reasoned with, and women should defend themselves. Also notice Sheila's sarcastic tone in this quote. This reflects a witty side to her character, making her likeable to the audience. You can also discuss that after her confrontation with Gerald, when the affair is revealed, she says, "I respect you more than I've ever done before." And she makes the decision not to go through with the engagement, which shows her growth. Unlike Mr. and Mrs. Birling, who try to convince Sheila to overlook the affair and marry him anyway, Sheila shows that she values truth and integrity over superficial expectation and materialism. Now, the second quote basically reiterates what we've said. Sheila is one of the first characters, if not the first, to catch on to the inspector's game. She understands that he acts as a voice of reason. Now, this brings us nicely onto our final link, which is Sheila and the inspector. The first quote really highlights that Sheila, as we said, catches on quite quickly and realizes the inspector is setting them up to admit their own guilty confessions. Instead of telling them what they've done wrong, he confronts the Birlings and Gerald in a way where they outwardly state their wrongs. This metaphor which Sheila uses is very dark and powerful, and it's a great quote to use in the exam. The reason being is that you can discuss this harsh language to mirror the harsh reality of them being criminalized and condemned for their actions. You can say that Sheila views the burden of what's happened to Eva as her death being on her hands, hence the dark metaphor. Another interpretation that you can add is that this echoes the harsh reality which the lower class have had to withstand when being discriminated against for their class. Remember to also use other quotes to connect how Sheila eventually stands up for the lower class and particularly girls like Eva, for example when she humanizes them and says they're people. So as we've covered, throughout the second half of the play, Sheila becomes a kind of stand-in for Priestley's own voice, as we said, echoing the inspector's message about socialism. Sheila says you're pretending everything's just as it was before. This contrasts Gerald's quote, which we saw earlier, where he has a very, "oh, it's fine, the inspector guy wasn't even real" attitude. This shows that Sheila has been permanently changed in contrast to other characters. This is a change which Priestley aims to glorify and liberate and influence onto his audience so that society is more fair in treatment towards the lower class. Sheila represents the idea that change should come from within, not just because somebody is watching. That's why she's often described as the voice of reason or the moral conscience of the play. Okay, so just to summarise, if you are ever asked about how Sheila is a character who's presented to change or what her role is in the play, ensure that you mention Sheila's transformation, her characters linked to different themes, try to also learn 2 to 3 well-analysed quotes per theme, and finally make sure you include her comparison to other characters in the play. Now that's all we have for Sheila. I really hope this breakdown helped you understand her character better. And if you found this helpful, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.